So there we go. And good evening, everyone. I'm Brenda Harrington, the program librarian at the Belfast Free Library. I want to welcome you to tonight's program, Sea Level Rise, Storms, and Citizen Science with Gayle Bowness from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. This program is also the official launch of a new library series, All of Belfast Climate Dialogues, a community memory project funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The ABCD project will focus on facilitating conversations about climate change and collecting Belfast residents' observations about how things have changed. To accomplish this, the library will host a series of programs on climate change topics like tonight's program, with follow-up sessions for conversation, reflection, and a chance to explore some of the practical things we may do in response to the impacts of climate change. Participants will also be invited to share their climate change observations in words, pictures, or videos to our new digital archive. We believe the archive that you all help create will capture a snapshot of what Belfast residents think today and start to reveal the climate change priorities of the region and potentially serve as a catalyst for taking action now. I invite you to join us for our first follow-up conversation and to learn more about this project and how you can participate. We have scheduled 2 Zoom sessions this Thursday at 9 a.m. and 6:30 p.m. They will be on Zoom. And to register for the Zoom link, you can go to belfastlibrary.org/ABCD events or email me, bharrington@belfastlibrary.org. And I will put both of those links in the chat in a few minutes. And I really encourage you to join us. It's going to be fun. We have a lot to show you, and we're going to be doing a lot in the coming months. So please stay tuned for more programs. Announcements. Before we get to tonight's presentation, I want to thank the City of Belfast Climate Crisis Committee for co-sponsoring this talk, and to recognize the important work that the Climate Crisis Committee has done and continues to do to educate the community about the impending climate change impacts facing us all. We will be hearing from John Beal, the chair of the committee, after Gayle's presentation. Tonight's speaker, Gayle Bowness, is the Coastal Resilience Program Manager at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, where she manages the Community Resilience Informed by Science and Education program through the Climate Center at GMRI, which provides coastal communities with knowledge, skills, and tools to develop community-focused resilience plans for coastal flooding. The talk, Sea Level Rise, Storms, and Citizen Science, is coming right up. So thank you for joining us, Gayle, and I pass the mic to you.
Thanks so much, Brenda. All right, I'll get my screen shared. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Super. Okay. Today, as Brenda said, we're going to be sharing with you some information around sea level rise, storms and storm surge, as well as a citizen science project that we launched alongside with the Climate Crisis Committee this past fall in Belfast. So that's kind of what you will hear from me today. But before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that as we're talking about climate impacts, today talking about sea level rise, but climate impacts in general are going to impact us all differently. And it's going to be a really kind of personal impact. So for some, you might have experienced some extremes as our climate is changing, whether that's flooding or heat or wildfires. And it might be flooding in a place that you care about. Perhaps there was some financial impact or some kind of emotional impact of climate change. So I just want to acknowledge that and make space for that and invite you to share your stories as kind of the ABCD project. That's kind of the spirit of that, is sharing your stories about climate change. And that's really how we can start to normalize a lot of these conversations as we talk about the data and we talk about our own personal experiences, because we are living today in a world that is a lot different than it was tomorrow or yesterday, let alone decades ago. So, all right, so just wanted to kind of open with that. And share, as we're talking about sea level rise, sea level rise is something that's not just going to happen to us in the future, it's something that has been happening for a long time. And we have a fair amount of data around that. So going back into the late 1800s, we've been collecting tide gauge data from around the globe. And in the most recent decades, we've been collecting satellite data about sea level. And as you look at each of these trend lines, you can see very clearly that the trend is up. Sea level has been increasing, and it's increased about 8 inches over the past 100 years. And in the past couple decades, that rate of rise has more than doubled what we have seen in that past. And so it's that rate of rise is something that we really need to keep an eye on when we're talking about climate impacts. Now, since we're talking about sea level rise, and that's something that we are experiencing today, I do invite you to type into the chat box if you have any kind of personal stories or experiences that you want to share, perhaps evidence of sea level rise that you have read about or experienced yourself. We would love to hear those stories in the chat box. So the causes for sea level rise are mostly twofold. One, that our oceans are warming, and as ocean water warms, it expands. It's going to take up more space. As you can see here in this map, the red is showing us where we're seeing above average temperatures. If you were to zoom into the Gulf of Maine, you can see that we are definitely in that company. Looking a little bit closer at the data, this is a graph pulled from the Maine Climate Science Dashboard, which is a really terrific resource that the state has recently published since they launched the Maine Climate Action Plan. So I do encourage you to check that out. So this is showing us how ocean waters have been warming here in the Gulf of Maine. And you may have heard the statistics already that the Gulf of Maine is warming at a rate that's faster than 99% of the rest of the world's oceans. Doesn't mean that it's warmer here. Clearly, it's pretty still chilly, especially in the early summers. But that rate of warmth, remember I mentioned that kind of trend line, that rate, that's what's really important. It's warming really quickly. So we're already having waters that are almost 4 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than what we have seen in the past. So a lot of ocean expansion here in the Gulf of Maine. But the other primary driver of sea level rise is ice melt. And this is ice on land that is melting and contributing volume into the oceans. So this isn't talking about kind of the icebergs or whatnot that are already in the ocean. That's like ice in your glass on a hot summer day that melts, the water level would stay the same. It's already displacing its volume. This is ice on land that is melting or moving into the oceans and then displacing the water as it enters. It's adding more volume. So how much might sea levels rise? I'm going to run through some data, and I do encourage you to also not just drop your stories in the chat box, but also any questions you might have in particular about the data. And then I will address them in the chat box, or we'll have a Q&A at the end of mine and John's talks. All right, so looking at the global data, we can see that there's kind of a rainbow of different trend lines here. And what these are showing us are different scenarios as to how we might see our future play out based off of decisions that we make today. So these different kind of scenarios are based off of different carbon emissions. So the bottom two are assuming that as a globe, we pretty much cut our carbon emissions yesterday and have already started sequestering carbon. And that would result in a really low kind of climate impacts into the future. But since we know that that's not the case, these two scenarios are rather unlikely. The middle two scenarios are assuming that as a globe, we're able to cut our carbon emissions by about 2040, that year 2040, and then start sequestering carbon. So we definitely still have some time to act and perhaps see these scenarios play out. The top two scenarios are assuming that as a globe, we continue to emit carbon along the same trends that we are today. So as I mentioned before, these are global mean sea levels. So they're showing us what would happen on average across the globe. But as we noted earlier, ocean warming is kind of happening at different rates in different places. So that's the same for sea level. It's going to rise at different rates in different places. This graph from NOAA is showing us that the trend lines of sea level rise that we've already been experiencing around the globe. As you can see, most of the arrows are going up, and there's different rates of rise. Here in the Gulf of Maine, that rate of rise is greater than the global average. So what does that look like for what we might see here? So this is the relative sea level change scenarios for Portland. We'll talk about local sea level data when we talk a bit more about the Citizen Science Project and exciting news that John has to share from the Climate Crisis Committee. Right now in Maine, we have 3 main tide gauges: Portland, Bar Harbor, and Eastport. And really depending upon where you are and which direction the weather from the ocean is coming that day, it will kind of vary which one's going to be most reflective of what you experience. But we'll use the Portland data for right now. So just like the global scenario, you can see that they're kind of, we still have those same ones. So like the low and intermediate low, again, are assuming that we cut carbon emissions yesterday and are sequestering carbon already. The middle two with a 2040 goal to cut carbon emissions as a globe, and the top two are assuming that we're along the lines of the same trends. So as you can see, they do vary quite greatly, where the lower scenarios see us with a foot of sea level rise by the year 2100, whereas the extreme scenarios, we're upwards of close to 11 feet by the year 2100. So it leaves us with this question of, well, what do we do as we are needing to plan? We can't just wait and see what happens, because it's much more costly to react to flooding as opposed to being proactive. So we need to make some decisions today. So the state of Maine has really done a great job at publishing and coming together and creating this kind of collective document, the Maine Climate Action Plan. And it's some different recommendations. So as a state, we're looking to just the intermediate and the high scenarios as to what we're going to be planning for into the future. So we're looking at kind of the 2050 scale and the 2100 scale when we're thinking about planning for. So kind of a short-term planning and long-term. And so Maine is recommending that for 2050, we plan for a sea level rise of 1.5 feet, but be prepared for a potential of 3 feet of rise. So looking at the intermediate and the high scenarios. But for 2100, we want to plan for 4 feet of rise, but be prepared for upwards of 8 feet of rise. So let's see what this looks like locally. Looking at graphs is one thing, and you can kind of think like, oh, well, personally, I'm 5'2", so what does that translate to what water would be? It's much easier to look at a map than just kind of guessing. So let's run through some different maps, and I will drop a link to this interactive sea level map in the chat box when I am done. So we're going to look at Belfast. So first, let's start with the highest annual tide. So this is what we see about this amount of sea level rise, like a couple times a year, that we would have sea level that's up around 12 feet of rise. The low scenario is an additional 1.2 feet of rise over that. And we've definitely experienced this already when we've had some of our more extreme storms. You can see where some of the flooding is starting to happen down in downtown Belfast. Intermediate low scenario gives us 1.6 feet of rise. And so this is roughly what the state is recommended to plan for by 2050, is this reality. And the intermediate scenario is also what we need to be prepared for by the year 2050, as it reflects almost 4 feet of sea level rise. The intermediate high scenario gives us 6 feet of rise. And the high scenario, 8.8 feet of rise. So this is what the state is recommending that we are also prepared for by the year 2100. So that long-term planning scenario. And then if we were to experience some storm surge that comes in on top of that, you also need to take that into account. And if there was a 2-foot surge on top of that high scenario, you would see something similar to this, the extreme scenario of almost 11 feet of sea level rise. So the Gulf of Maine Research Institute is working collaboratively with coastal communities to provide knowledge, to work on skill development, to share tools, and to support communities in making community-driven and data-driven resilience plans for sea level rise. And we have various projects and programs that we're working on to do that. I think that the ABCD program that the Belfast Free Library is working on is also a great complement to this work because again, it's capturing your experiences and really importantly, it's starting a dialogue within your community, which is really key to us all supporting a lot of these decisions that we're going to have to make in the near future. Today, I'm going to share with you a bit more about the Citizen Science Project. So back in probably 2-ish, maybe almost 3 years ago at this point, when Belfast published their first kind of sea level rise document, the Climate Change Committee at the time did all of that hard work and really noted that we need some more local data. Maine has just a few tide gauges that are collecting really great data. And we've got over 4,000 miles of coastline, and we have a lot of unique harbors and inlets, and Belfast is one of those. And so all this different bathymetry in the ocean and the geography of the land and the direction of the storms and the level of the water really impacts what happens locally. So we have this kind of problem or gnarly problems. How do we understand these local impacts of water level and weather and the local impacts of flooding in our own community? So they reached out to the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. We've been doing citizen science projects, primarily with students, but also with communities for over a decade. And so we were really thrilled to be able to work with the Climate Crisis Committee on designing this project. So what we developed was the Coastal Flooding Storms and Sea Level Rise project. It was launched in Belfast in the fall of 2020, and in the past 2 months, we expanded the project to work with the cities of Portland and South Portland, and we'll be launching this in Vinyl Haven later this summer. So we're really excited that Belfast was kind of the pilot community for that, and your work is really being used throughout the Gulf of Maine region. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit about the website so that way you're familiar with it. So on the landing page, it gives you a little bit of background information on the project and why we're working on this project, why it's important. If you scroll down on the website, you will see kind of this toolbar here. It's how you navigate around. Scroll down a little bit further, there's some additional information about the project, more information on sea level rise, links to these interactive maps that we were just looking at. And then the list of participating communities is here, which you can expand to view more information, which provides context as to why this community is participating. One of the things that sets this project apart from other citizen science projects is that we're specifically partnering with municipalities on this work, wanting to focus community attention on different areas that the community is concerned about. So that way we're collecting data that's relevant to the decision-making that the communities need to make. Over on the Prep and Collect page, you can find more information about the project and kind of how you would be out there collecting data. And for this project, it's pretty simple. Really, all you need to do is print out one of these data sheets or take your smartphone out into the field and you can collect some data. Scroll down a little bit further, gives you some more context about Belfast and the different locations that we've identified to collect data at. And you can also view these on the Coastal Flood Monitoring Sites map, which is linked to through that website. So these are the 6 sites that that Belfast is concerned about and collecting data upon. And if you click on one of the images or zoom in on the map and click on one of the blue arrows, you can get some additional information about that site. So I'm just going to run through a quick example of uploading data. And since I couldn't get to Belfast recently, this is kind of an example from Portland as I was walking along the East End beach. I noticed it was a really high tide that day, like much higher than I have seen in the past. This beach usually extends well down into the corner of this picture. So I wanted to capture the tide that day and took some images. So when you go to the website to contribute, you can, to upload your data, you can either use this little kind of balloon on the top and zoom in and put your data point where it belongs on the map, or you can scroll down and you can put in the longitude and latitude. If you know that, you can also get that data from looking at kind of a map app on your smartphone or Google Maps online. So I dropped my little pin here at the East End Beach and I entered in the date that I made that observation. And then it's going to collect some additional data. So we want to make sure we have that georeference data, but we also want to know the time of the observation. That way we can look to see what the predicted high water or high tide was that day, that water level was that day. So if you're at a place where there's a monitoring site, you can select where that was. I was in Portland prior to the monitoring site, so it's not on this list, but you'll see those 6 locations for Belfast here. Then they'll also ask kind of, well, what is happening here today? What are you observing? So I was just checking out what the site looked like. I didn't go there for any kind of purpose. And I noticed that the water was higher before. It looked like unusually high water to me. And no, I had not seen flooding in this location before. Uploaded my 3 photos. You are required to upload 2, and you can upload up to 4 different photos. Pretty simple. And then another piece of this project that really sets it aside for how is it prioritizing their decision making down the road. So how does this flooding impact you? Does it impact kind of your travel route? Were you blocked? Could you not get where you wanted to go? Does it flood a place that you care about? Was it your property? Does it impact you? And then how is it impacting your community? So this is a drop down list asking questions like, is this causing economic damage to your community? Is it a historic or a cultural site? For this one, I chose it was flooding a natural landscape as that was a beach. And then what's your level of concern about this flooding is also another question that we want to learn more about. Is this something that you're concerned about if it were to happen more frequently? Then we just ask that, hey, I uploaded the best data to my knowledge. I've checked my work, and you click submit. And then you can view your data on the website. So we're really excited that to date, Belfast has well over 100 observations. You guys have been doing such great work getting out and making observations at these different locations around town. And it's definitely going to be supporting the municipality and making decisions down the road. So some plans that we do have to make this data more valuable and to support this with decision making, and you'll hear more about this from John in just a minute, is that we're going to be, like I said, linking this data through to water level data. Right now, we've got those 3 tide gauges in Maine that we have, and Belfast is kind of in between Portland and Bar Harbor. So having that local water level data is really important. And John is going to share with you an update from the Climate Crisis Committee that's going to support collecting some of that data. So since we have the location and we have the timestamp of when your observation was made, we'll be able to know what the water level, predicted water level was for that day. And then we're also going to be linking it through to weather data. So we know how weather and water level are impacting what we're actually experiencing. So this is kind of our pilot phase of getting folks out there and collecting data, not too dissimilar from just sharing your observations and sharing stories like the ABCD program is asking you to do. But we are looking forward to providing more quantitative data alongside with this, alongside with citizen observations that will support municipalities in making decisions in the near future as to building resilience in your community. So that's all I have for you. I am going to pass things over to John. And if you have any questions, like I said, type them in the chat, or I'm happy to take them later. Thank you.
Gayle, thank you very much for that discussion of the GMI program, both its history and its purpose. As you said, I'm going to sort of bring us down to what's going on locally right now. If you have walked around the harbor or around the shore, you may have run across these posts, observation posts, which have a little sign on them describing this project. And those are the 6 observation posts from which you can take pictures of areas of concern we have on the coastline. There's one at the boathouse, at the breakwater, Armistice Bridge, Kaler Road, which really should be called Robbins Road, the Stevenson Rangeway, and the City Park. City Park, for instance, the city did about $80,000 worth of riprap installation last year because of the storm damage there from 17. And we're going to be documenting how much storm action there still is there. So one of the things that, for me, citizen science is really important about is getting data. I want to develop a term data set for Belfast, not only as useful for Belfast, but also as a contribution to the whole NOAA observation system. One of the reasons that GMI got together with us to develop this program is because, excuse me, they had been contacted by John Cannon of the National Weather Service in Gray. John is sort of a very well-experienced predictor of storms and surge, and he was very interested in having some local observations about what happened with his predictions. So we sort of developed this program so that we could ground truth his predictions. As Gayle said, there's only the closest tide gauges are in Bar Harbor and in Portland. The last time that actual tide levels were measured in Belfast was in 1983 and 84. There was a temporary station put up to determine the relationship between Bar Harbor and Portland and Belfast. But that was almost 40 years ago. And not only has sea level risen, but weather is changing. So one of the things we're really interested in seeing, as Gayle indicated, is not just the tide levels, but what happens with surge and what happens with weather, wind direction, wind speed, those things will all determine the amount of surge we get. And of course, surge is the real damager, not just high tide. High tides are pretty predictable. Surge is often not. One of the things that we're doing in Belfast, we've been working for almost 2 years with the Army Corps of Engineers to put up a monument as to where the 1978 flood came. For those of you who were in New England in 1988, it was a huge snowstorm blizzard. And I personally was living in Massachusetts at the time. We had 3 feet of snow. The whole New England was shut down. In Maine, there was less snow, but a lot of wind and tide and surge. And in February and in January of 78, the highest surges ever recorded on the coast of Maine were observed and documented. So what we're doing is we're putting up, with the Army Corps, putting up a couple of monuments on the boardwalk, which will show where the height was in 78. And then it'll have a chart that shows the predicted high, sea level rise in 2050. And then new markers that show if the modest scenario, the low scenario of sea level rise occurs, this is where a 1978 surge would come today. And if the higher scenario plays out, it will have a mark that shows where it would be in 2050. So it's hoping to bring home to people not just how high that water was in 1978, but also when sea level rises, how much greater that that surge will be. So, Gayle was talking about the highest annual tide and how that's going to rise over the years. But even more significant for city planning has got to be anticipated surge. For instance, in about 1997, MBNA, which, as you know, was a major employer in Belfast, decided it would build a marina for its yachts that it hoped to have to attract clients. And they looked at the boathouse and decided to fashion a new place there. They had an engineering study done. That engineering study indicated that because there's a 6-mile fetch from the southeast, the potential in a major blow was for waves of 10 to 14 feet. At that point, MBNA said, well, I don't think we'll build a marina here because it's so apt to damage. And that was without even taking into account sea level rise. So although the pictures of the sea level rise generally looks pretty modest and gradual, in fact, there's potential for a great deal of damage as sea level rise and climactic change in the form of severe weather combine to develop storm surge. So with the assistance of GMRI, we began this project a couple of years ago. And besides developing the observation posts, we also decided to put in a weather station and a tide gauge. The weather station we put in last November. If you have any interest in knowing exactly what's going on in Belfast on the harbor, you go to Weather Underground and you go to station KME BELFA 20. And you can, if I just looked at it a minute ago, it says exactly what's going on there. We don't have a camera. There was some feeling that the fishermen did not want to have cameras watching them. And so we respected that. But that weather station has been working very well. There's a display in the harbor master's office 24 hours a day. And we've in fact just talked to Kathy about maybe moving that to an outside window so that people can see it even when her office is not open. But it's also uploaded 24/7 onto Weather Underground. So that's the first element that we want to add into these observations. We want to be able to have Gayle's network be able to correlate weather conditions with high water conditions. And then, of course, we want to have a tide gauge. So we negotiated for a while with the city. We got a good grant from the city, supplemented by a grant from GMRI to buy a tide gauge. I will admit that COVID has sort of slowed us down in terms of dealing with vendors and testing things. Only today, spurred by this Zoom conference, did I actually put in the purchase order for a tide gauge. Now, NOAA, if you go to the NOAA tide gauge at Bar Harbor, you'll notice it's a 6-inch PVC pipe, big heavy pipe, goes down into the harbor, and there's an ultrasonic sensor up top which shoots sound waves to the top of it. The PVC pipe is what's called a stilling well. It creates still surface of water so that the ultrasonic sounds can bounce off in a non-random way. And then that's uplinked to satellites and onto the world. We first thought about doing that. And in fact, Dave Thomas and Dave Sprague have been working with the Belfast area high school students for the last year, developing an ultrasonic tide gauge. They've tested it some. They've got it rigged up on the harbor. If you go to the harbor and climb behind the gas tanks, you'll see something that looks curiously like a pin cushion, but what it is it's the resting place for the ultrasonic sensor, and the sticking up dowels are to keep birds from pooping on it. It's a standard method of keeping birds from doing that. So they're working on the ultrasound, but I consulted with NOAA about the kind of tide gauge they're putting in now, and was informed that in fact they prefer to use non-contact methods because, for instance, I think a lot of you are familiar with the UMO tidal surge research, which has been done in Belfast and the Bagadoos for the last 3 years. They used pressure sensors. You put them in the bottom of the water and they measure the water column above them. That tells you how much water is above, and you take it out once a month, download the information, and you get the information there. I was not thrilled with that because I was hoping to have a live 24/7 feed rather than just the occasional download dump. Also, the NOAA people told me that there's some difficulty with calibrating that because of salinity changes, temperature changes. It can even ice up. So we then moved to looking at non-contact ideas. We looked at laser beams and we looked at radar. Laser is good, but the problem is that laser sometimes penetrates the surface of the water, so you don't get an actual reading off the surface, depending on the clarity of the water. So what we decided to do was to go with radar. Radar pretty reliably bounces off the water and comes back. The model that we've gotten is going to take a measurement every six times every second. That will download to Kathy's office and be averaged out. Dave Sprague is working on algorithms to make it work. I count entirely on his expertise. So we'll be able to measure not only tide and surge height, but because it's not going to be within a stilling well, we're also hoping to be able to measure wave height. So another aspect of potential damage is how high your waves are. You can have, a reasonable surge, but if the waves are 3 or 4 feet tall, then you get more damage. So it's good to know that. So we hope to have the tide gauge materials in the next week and to begin installing it this summer. My intention and Dave's is to engage the high school students who have started this project to keep it going. And then eventually we'll work with Gayle and her IT people to figure out how to correlate and mesh that information on the website. Once we do that, I think we'll be able to really tell John Cannon how we're ground truthing his stuff. And we'll be able to start developing a really thorough picture about how the weather and sea level rise changes are affecting Belfast Harbor and Belfast Bay, so that the city will be able to plan for the future. One of the biggest concerns the city has is about downtown waterfront. There's a big lot called Belfast Yards, on which there's some discussion about development. It's pretty close to the highest annual tide. So what the predictions are for tidal change and surge, et cetera, are really important in making decisions there. So that's my update about what the Climate Crisis Committee has been doing. And what I'll do is I'll hand it back over to Brenda and to Gayle. And I understand that they've invited questions through the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Nobody's typed in a question, but I was excited to hear your news about the tide gauge. And I had a question. Are you going to locate it in that same place where you had the test site going with that pipe?
Yeah. Yes, we're putting it there. I looked at various other places, but there's too much boating and cargo and fish removal going on anywhere else. And we also have a good power source right there. So Kathy's been very collaborative with us throughout this whole project, and she's giving us space there on the railing to put our tide gauge in. Now, you should know the ambitious young folks at the high school would like to develop a series of tide gauges all around Belfast Bay so that we can get a picture of not just what's happening at the pier, but at other key places, such as perhaps those other 6 observation posts. But that's going to depend on how our new prototype works, how replicable it is. One of the things that's going to be really fun is the radar gauge is going to be put in next to the student's ultrasonic gauge. So we're able to calibrate between the two of them, the accuracy. We also, the Army Corps of Engineers has given us a marker showing us exactly where NAVD 88 is at the pier, which is the whole, the baseline for tide measurements. And so we're gonna be able to tie that into the National Geodetic Survey benchmarks. And so it should be a very interesting and precise calibration that we can achieve.
Cool. I actually have another question. When are you going to get the 1978 flood marker installed?
Well, we just approved their markers 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
They had made some mistakes, so we corrected that before they got to the printer.
Okay.
This is the government. It has been literally 2 years since we started this project. When we started the project, there was a different administration in the office, and we were told we couldn't talk about some things about sea level rise and climate change, but that's changed now. So I think our boards will be informative.
Okay, cool. Thank you. And thank you, Gayle, for your wonderful presentation. Does anybody else have any questions? Please unmute yourselves and, go for it. Ask some questions.
Okay, I have one.
Hi, Corliss. Do you have a question?
Yeah, didn't the governor just recently sign a resolve, I think? I'm not quite sure exactly what it was that had to do with sea level rise. I think that asks, I'm curious to know more about it. Asks agencies or cities to consider sea level rise in their decision making.
I can answer with respect to the main climate plan, which issued December 1st. In that extremely long and complex document, the governor and her task force make it clear, excuse me, make several things clear. First of all, they specifically advise that cities plan for the 1.6, I think it is, feet rise by 2050 and be prepared for the larger one. They also say that current comprehensive plans and other planning tools used by cities typically don't take climate change into effect. We discussed this in our committee last year, and the analogy that we came up with was that typically cities plan for the future in their comprehensive plans in 3 dimensions. We want them to add a 4th dimension, time, with the understanding that in time there is going to be change, that you can't rely on this river being this way for the next 50 years. It's going to change. Same with the sea level rise and other conditions which will be changed by climate change. Does that respond to your question, Corliss?
Well, kind of, yeah. There was definitely a document signed. I'll have to look into it myself.
Yeah, there were several bills in front of the legislature recently. I haven't been keeping up with them like I should be. We've got a lot going on, but I know there was at least 3, I think, that had to do with sea level. Some were more around, like you had just mentioned, that the towns adopt the recommendations from the main climate plan, which John just summarized. But there's a couple others that would support funding, which is desperately needed in order for towns to have proper assessments, proper vulnerability assessments, as well, kind of engineer design solutions, and then to actually like boots on the ground, shovel ready projects in order to fund that work. So I know some of those bills did include some financial components.
Yeah, I did hear something about it as well, Corliss, but I can't, it was just the other day, I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah, not too long ago.
Yeah, so we have a question. Misty asks about the US Army Corps markers. They sound great. She's only lived in Belfast for 10 years. Does anyone here on this Zoom call recall the high tide, the high storm surges of 1978? Anybody on this call, were you here? Were you in Belfast? We should put out a call for that. That would be interesting to hear people's memories of that and reactions to that. So.
That would be for your project, your memory
Yeah,
project.
yeah, for the project. Yeah, absolutely.
We did not find anyone
Oh.
who could show us on their own volition, but we did have a lot of reports that there was a little nail nailed into the wall of Marshall's Wharf, marking the high spot where the water line came.
Okay.
We looked carefully for it. We could not find it, but there's a wonderful report from back then that describes, where the seaweed ended up. And
Where did you find that report, John? In the paper?
no, this 1979. There was a very thorough Army Corps and National Geodetic Survey, I think, did it, and carefully measured all up and down the entire east coast of New England, the damage done.
Wow.
I've read a similar report for the Portland area, and it's similar kind of markers. It was, we saw the water all the way up next to Big Jimmy's red truck that was parked to the old next to the old Pine Street on such and such a road. So it was definitely different methods of data collection back in '78 of marking kind of where the water went. It was a lot of very local references. It was a great scientific report to read.
Even in the official reports, they use local markers which are hard to track down. For instance, one of the Geodetic Survey markers is in the flagpole in the Stego Auto Parts building. Well, there ain't no Stego Auto Parts building anymore. It's now the Thai restaurant at the bottom of Main Street. We will track that down, but a lot of things have changed. So that's why it's really nice that we have these permanent benchmarks in the stone and in the bridges that we can measure against.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. Thank you, Corliss, for putting that in the chat. She said what the bill was, LD 1572, and Representative Lydia Bloom enacted into law sea level rise. I'm going to go look that up. And Gayle says she's a great advocate. Is she the one from Cape Elizabeth?
York.
York. Okay.
Lydia Bloom has been leading this whole project for 2 years.
That's great. And that, just like Gayle said, does that provide money and resources for communities? You don't know. We have to go look it up. That'll be another program.
I don't think this one does. That wouldn't be a different bill.
Yeah. Okay.
I think one of the illustrations I'd like to talk about the effect of surge and weather is in 1976, 2 years before the '78 flood. There was a storm that came up on Dobbs Day, and the storm surge and the wind were such that it blew a wall of water straight up into downtown Bangor. And in the space of like half an hour, you see a picture of cars flooded to their rooftops on Kenduskeag Stream. It was just wind and water, totally unexpected. And that's the sort of thing we want to keep an eye out on. See what happens when the wind is from certain directions and the tide is in a certain state.
Well, Anybody else have any questions? Well, I want to remind you that I put into the chat, my email address, if you scroll up, and the link to the place to sign up for a follow-up conversation where we're going to have a conversation and show you all around what we have planned for the ABCD project. It's changed, John, from before, just saying. So we're excited to keep doing more, and I want you all to know that lots more is coming, and to keep your radar out. And I'm happy to stay if anybody else has any more questions, or you have anything else to say, Gayle, to like follow up, and let's stay in touch. Let us
All of
know.
the above. No, what I did want to say though is that nationally and regionally, there are so many data gaps when it comes to having local data that will inform decision making. And it's unfortunately kind of been up to municipalities to fill those gaps. And it's really hard work, really hard work. And even alluding, like, the systems complex, the dynamics are complex. Like the storm that John just referenced that flooded up into Bangor. We have in Maine tidal rivers that have a major impact too. We've got a lot of water coming down from our watershed, and as the surge comes up, like, we don't know what that looks like. There's no visualization for that. There's no data for that yet. So there's a lot of gaps that we need to fill. And I'm proud of Belfast. You guys are taking some really huge leaps on addressing these data gaps, and you're finding solutions, and thrilled to be a part of the project and to continue supporting this work. But you guys are definitely leading that within the state. So kudos to you all.
Well, thank you. And thank you, John, and the Climate Crisis Committee for being important leads on this for our town.
I also could just throw in a plug in here for the actual use of the observation posts. I have a half a dozen people whom I inform when I get a notice of high water event prediction from the National Weather Service. And I'm happy to add anyone who wants to that list. If you want to know when it's expected there's going to be a big storm, and you want to go out and take a picture at high tide at some local area or one of the 6 spots, we'd love to have you join us and upload them to the website as Gayle described. I will say that the website is not quite as intuitive as I'd like it to be, but then I have a hard time with my cell phone. But please, if anybody would like to contribute or be informed of when the high storms are expected, send me an email.
What's your email?
JSRBEAL@gmail.
Okay. I also want to say that it doesn't have to be that hard to take a picture and upload it. When I do it, I take the pictures and then I come home. I don't upload it right then because there's a lot of stuff you have to fill out. I just make a note of what time I was there. I think there's a timestamp on my camera. So then I upload them from my laptop from home. That's just how I do it. And I just wanted to share that with you all because it makes it easier. So,
Thank you, Brenda.
you're welcome. Try it. Well, if nobody else has any questions, I want to thank you all for coming, and thank Gayle for the presentation and the update on the citizen science coastal flooding project. And John, all your updates are exciting. So this is all good going forward, and we can stay involved.
Thank you for hosting us.
You're welcome.